$2.5 trillion. That is what Russia has spent on its war against Ukraine. $2.5 trillion. And what does Russia have to show for it? A strip of occupied territory roughly one-tenth the size of Texas. That works out to approximately $90 million for every single square mile of Ukrainian land that Russia has managed to hold. $90 million per square mile. Think about what that means. While the Kremlin burns through the savings of an entire nation, Russia's people are watching food prices climb by 167% on something as basic as potatoes. Soldiers on the front lines have been reduced to eating the dead, and the approval rating of the man who started all of this has now fallen for 7 consecutive weeks to its lowest point since the war began. Something has broken inside Russia. Not just the economy, not just the military, something deeper. And in this video, we are going to trace exactly how it happened. We will look at the numbers behind Russia's economic collapse, the food crisis unfolding in Russian homes and on Russian battlefields, the fury rising from business people and politicians who were once loyal to Putin, and what the falling approval ratings actually tell us about a regime that has spent years convincing the world and itself that it is indestructible. We will look at how Putin turned Russia into a war machine, what that machine has cost, and why the fuel is finally running out. But first, let us go back to the beginning of this story, to the moment Putin launched what he told his people would be a quick, clean, professional military operation. That was over 4 years ago. For Putin, the invasion of Ukraine was never just about Ukraine. It was about legacy. It was about restoring something that had been lost. The weight, the fear, the reach of Soviet power projected outward across Europe and the world. He was going to reclaim history. He was going to make Russia great again on his own terms, through the barrel of a gun and the roar of a tank column. He got his Soviet era, just not the one he wanted. What Russia is living through right now is not the triumphant expansionist Soviet Union of the 1950s and 60s. It is the hollow, decaying Soviet Union of the 1980s. It is Brezhnev's stagnation. It is the breadlines and the bleak apartments, and the economy built entirely around weapons that cannot sustain a population. It is a country cannibalizing itself to feed a war it cannot win and cannot stop. Here is where it gets serious. Russia's GDP grew at over 4% for 2 straight years in 2023 and 2024. Putin looked like a man who had beaten the West at its own game. The war machine hummed. The military-industrial complex expanded. Oil revenues cushioned the blow of sanctions. Russia's defenders and the financial press called it an economic miracle, a nation under siege, outperforming expectations. But the machine was eating the country from the inside. In 2025, GDP growth collapsed to just 1% for the entire year. In the first 2 months of 2026, Russia's economy contracted by 1.8%. That is not a stumble. That is a structural collapse beginning to reveal itself. Interest rates designed to choke off runaway inflation are now choking off investment. Sanctions that took years to fully bite have finally drawn blood. Russian businesses owed a record-breaking $109 billion in unpaid commercial bills as of January 2026. Read that again. $109 billion in unpaid bills in a single-month snapshot. Investment into Russia, both domestic and from abroad, has been all but strangled. The businesses that remain are caught in a vice between rising costs, falling revenues, and a government demanding more from them every quarter. Even the oil windfall, the temporary surge in crude prices triggered by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, cannot paper over what is happening beneath the surface. The International Monetary Fund raised its GDP forecast for Russia in 2026, but only to 1.1%. Russia needs oil revenues at current elevated levels to hold through the end of the year just to hit its own budget targets. The moment the United States and Iran reach a settlement, the moment that pressure in the Persian Gulf eases, the buffer is gone, and Russia falls back into the hole. Until now, Putin had been able to absorb these shocks, throw money at the problem, mobilize more men, redefine success, keep the propaganda machine running, and the dissent quiet. But the quiet is breaking. A senior Russian official described the national mood in terms that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The war has dragged on longer than the Great Patriotic War, longer than the Second World War itself, and Russia has not even secured a single region. Not one. After 4 years, after $2.5 trillion, after hundreds of thousands of lives, Russia has a fraction of eastern Ukraine and a body count that grows every week. That sentiment is not coming only from anonymous officials whispering to foreign journalists. It is coming from inside the government itself. Gennady Zyuganov, the longtime leader of Russia's Communist Party and a man who has spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of Kremlin politics, stood up in the State Duma and warned that Russia is heading for the kind of collapse that last occurred in 1917. He has said it 10 times, he declared. The economic collapse is inevitable. The first quarter of 2026 has already hit rock bottom. If urgent measures are not taken, what comes next will look like the fall of the Tsar. Think about what it takes for a man in that position to say those words out loud, in public, in a session of parliament. This is not a Western critic or a dissident in exile. This is a figure embedded in the Russian political establishment, warning that the state is running out of road. And he is not alone. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once the richest man in Russia, now based in London after years of imprisonment ordered by Putin himself, is blunter still. The patriotic fervor that launched this war has evaporated. Whatever emotional energy Russians once invested in the idea of a swift, victorious campaign is gone. The news that Russia won or lost 3 villages on the front line means nothing to the people enduring what they are enduring at home. Nothing. The sacrifice is too large and the gains are too small, and everyone in Russia can feel that gap widening. But here is the thing about oligarchs. And men with something to lose tend to keep their criticisms coded, careful, deniable. It is the people without that protection who are starting to speak. In Moscow, small business owners are watching their livelihoods collapse in real time. Tax changes introduced at the start of 2026 have pushed 65% of Russia's small enterprises into unprofitable territory in just the first quarter of the year. 65%. These are not large corporations with access to state contracts or connections to the defense sector. These are the businesses that form the backbone of Russia's domestic economy: restaurants, logistics firms, retailers, service providers, the people who make a city function. They are being bled dry. Higher taxes, higher interest rates, a chronic labor shortage, because the men who would have been running these businesses are either dead in Ukraine, working in a weapons factory, or have fled the country. The government's own numbers reveal the absurdity of it all. Tax revenues from businesses operating under Russia's special simplified tax codes fell by 16% in the first quarter of 2026, compared to the same period in 2025. Putin is squeezing Russia's private sector so hard it is producing less revenue, not more. And yet the war spending does not stop. One businesswoman who manages a logistics company in Moscow said it plainly. She remembers the Soviet era. She remembers the Iron Curtain. She was certain after the Soviet Union fell that the world would never go back to that. She was wrong. Russia now has what she calls a digital Iron Curtain. The same suffocation, the same information blackout, the same silencing of voices, only now it runs on algorithms and surveillance technology instead of barbed wire and state censors. Another Moscow business owner summed up the paralysis that has settled over Russia's commercial class. Nobody knows how long this war will last. Not the government, not the generals, not Putin. And with that uncertainty comes a creeping fear that the state is not finished taking. That whatever is left after the taxes, after the regulations, after the interest rate hikes, will eventually be targeted too. 63.5% of Russian business representatives expect economic conditions to get worse. 25% expect them to stay the same. Almost nobody is looking ahead with optimism. Stay with us, because the picture gets much darker before it offers anything like resolution. Before we get to food, and we will get to food, because that is where the despair becomes visceral and undeniable. We need to talk about the logic that brought Russia here, because none of this was accidental. This was a choice. A series of choices made by one man who was certain he understood economics, military power, and human nature better than everyone around him. Putin's economic strategy for the war was, in its own terms, coherent. You transform the economy into a war machine. You flood the military-industrial complex with state money. You force businesses to pivot toward defense contracts. You use oil revenues to absorb the shock of sanctions. And you wait for the West to fracture, because the West always fractures eventually. History told him that. He was certain of it. For 2 years, it even worked. Defense industries expanded. Employment in weapons manufacturing surged. The GDP numbers looked better than the economists who imposed the sanctions had hoped. Putin gave speeches about Russia's resilience. His allies pointed at the GDP figures and said, "See, the sanctions have failed." What they were actually seeing was a country converting its future into its present. Every ruble poured into tank production is a ruble not invested in a hospital, a school, a factory that makes something people can use in their daily lives. Every engineer building missiles is an engineer not building infrastructure. Every young man in a uniform is a young man not starting a business, training in a trade, or raising a family. Russia was burning its seed corn to keep warm, and nobody at the top was willing to say it. Maxim Reshetnikov, Russia's own economic development minister, stated what the numbers confirm. Russia's financial reserves are exhausted. Not strained, not under pressure, exhausted. The cushion that gave Putin room to absorb sanctions is gone. What remains is an economy running on debt, on elevated oil prices that depend on a conflict in the Persian Gulf continuing indefinitely, and on the political will of a population that is quietly running out of both patience and food. So why does this matter? Because attrition warfare, which is what this conflict has become on every dimension, military, economic, and social, depends on one side being able to outlast the other. Russia's bet was that its pain threshold was higher than Ukraine's, that Western support would eventually weaken, that time was on Russia's side. That bet is failing. Not because Ukraine has become stronger, though it has. Not because Western support has been as consistent as it could have been, because it has not. But because Russia's own internal costs have grown beyond what even a highly centralized, authoritarian state can manage through suppression alone. The economics of exhaustion are working, just not in the direction Putin intended. Here is where it gets worse. Food. Consumer prices in Russia have risen 77% since 2015. 77%. In the decade since Putin's first major act of aggression, the annexation of Crimea, and the beginning of a lower-intensity conflict in eastern Ukraine, the cost of living has nearly doubled, and food is at the sharp end of that spike. Potatoes, a staple of Russian diets across the income spectrum, cost 167% more in 2026 than they did in 2024. 2 years, 167%. Milk is up 59%. Canned beans are up 55%. Basic white bread, the most foundational item in a household pantry, is up 45%. On top of all of this, Russia has raised its value-added tax from 20 to 22%, layering a government surcharge onto an already punishing price environment. And in 2025, Russia's harvest was one of the worst in nearly 2 decades. Russia once banned the import of Western food products as an act of economic retaliation against the sanctions imposed after Crimea. That posture of agricultural self-sufficiency is now a liability. A bad harvest means Russia must import more. Imported food costs more than domestically grown food. And, with the economy in the state it is in, the foreign currency reserves needed to sustain large-scale food imports are not growing. They are shrinking. The result is a population that is not starving in the way that defined the darkest chapters of Soviet history. Not yet. But food insecurity is rising. Budgets are being stretched. Choices are being made between meat and vegetables, between heating a home and filling a refrigerator, that a generation of Russians assumed they would never have to make again. For the men Putin has sent to fight this war, the situation is even more extreme. Ukrainian military intelligence has intercepted communications from Russian units on the front line. What those intercepts describe is not a conventional logistical failure. Russian soldiers have been found to be consuming the bodies of their fallen comrades. At least 5 confirmed instances. Some soldiers have not simply been eating the dead. Some have been killing their living comrades for the same purpose. Read that sentence again and let it settle. This is what 4 years of war, $2.5 trillion spent, and a command structure built on political loyalty rather than military competence produces. Not glory, not an empire. Soldiers killing each other for food in the mud of eastern Ukraine. Putin promised in March of 2022, within the first month of the invasion, that only professional military personnel would serve in Ukraine. The young would be protected. Conscripts completing their mandatory service would not be deployed to combat zones. That promise is gone. Russia's military now recruits aggressively, dangling enormous cash payments to draw in anyone willing to sign a contract, regardless of age or experience. Conscripts supposed to be serving in the Russian interior are being shipped to the front. By the middle of 2025, verified deaths of 18-year-old Russian soldiers in Ukraine numbered at least 245 confirmed cases across a 2-year period. Not career soldiers, not volunteers, 18-year-olds who were never supposed to be there. And for those who avoid the front, Russia is building another path into the machine. Students are being offered substantial financial incentives to train as drone engineers or operators. Russia denies that any pressure is being applied. Russia has denied many things that turned out to be true. A 19-year-old student living in Russia today described the world he inhabits with devastating clarity. Complete hopelessness, the feeling that nothing can be changed. Everyone wants to leave. Most cannot. Nobody wants to build their life in this country. It is expensive, it is bleak, and the options available to someone his age are narrowing toward 2. Fight the war, or feed the war machine. That is what Putin's grand imperial vision has delivered to Russia's youngest generation. And then there is Russia's youth. And this is where the story becomes not just an economic or political crisis, but a human one. Russia is losing its future to a war its future did not choose. Picture the calculation a 19-year-old in Moscow faces right now. The small businesses that might have employed them are collapsing. The universities that might have educated them toward a global career are producing graduates who cannot emigrate without being labeled traitors. The military is offering sums of money that look enormous until you remember what people are being paid to do. And the government has made clear, through 4 years of broken promises and policy reversals, that no commitment it makes to spare the young from combat is binding. Putin pledged in March of 2022 that conscripts would not go to Ukraine. He pledged that the young would not be sent to fight. They were sent to fight. By mid-2025, at least 245 confirmed 18-year-old Russian soldiers had been killed in a war they were legally and officially told they would never be sent into. Meanwhile, Russia is building new pathways to conscript the young without calling it conscription. Students are being targeted with financial offers to become drone engineers. The framing is opportunity, good pay, technical training, a career in a growth sector. The reality is that Russia needs drone operators because drones are killing and being killed at a rate that exhausts supply chains. And the students filling those roles today are the people who might have built Russia's technology sector tomorrow. This is what economists call the destruction of human capital. It is the least visible and most devastating form of war cost. Destroyed tanks can be replaced. Depleted ammunition stocks can be replenished given time and money. But a generation of people who leave the country, who die in combat, who spend their formative years building weapons instead of skills, who look at their nation and see nothing worth staying for, that loss compounds over decades. It is not recoverable in the short term. It may not be recoverable at all. A 19-year-old described his reality in terms that should haunt anyone still arguing that Russia's people are united behind this war. Complete hopelessness, a feeling that nothing can change, an overwhelming desire to leave, an inability for most to actually do so. No attachment to the country's future, no belief that the country has a future worth attaching to. This is the Russia that Putin has created. Not through accident, not through external pressure alone, through deliberate choices, sustained over 4 years of a war he refuses to stop. Here is where it matters most. Putin's power has always rested on a specific foundation. The fiction that he is in control, that his decisions are working, that the sacrifice his people make is producing results commensurate with the cost. He has maintained that fiction for over 25 years through a combination of genuine popularity, manufactured consensus, propaganda, and the systematic elimination of anyone who challenged the narrative. That foundation is cracking. State-run polling, polling controlled by the Russian government, polling that exists to validate Putin, polling that has every incentive to inflate his numbers, now shows his approval rating at 65.6%, the lowest it has been since 2022. Trust in Putin has declined to 71%. Both figures have been falling for 7 consecutive weeks, down more than 7 and 6 percentage points respectively over that period. 65% still sounds like a majority. It is, but it must be understood in context. In Russia, expressing disapproval of Vladimir Putin carries real personal risk. Criticism of the war is illegal. People have been imprisoned for holding blank signs in public spaces. Dissent of any kind invites surveillance, harassment, job loss, or worse. The person who tells a pollster they disapprove of Putin is taking a risk that the person who tells a pollster in a Western democracy they disapprove of their leader simply does not face. Putin's approval rating was once 88%. It is now 23 points lower. In a country where fear enforces conformity, a drop of that size does not represent shifting opinion. It represents something much more significant. It represents people who have decided that the consequences of honesty now feel smaller than the consequences of continuing to lie. That is the tell. When people stop performing loyalty, even when the performance used to feel safe, the regime has a problem. Not an immediate existential crisis, but a shift in the underlying pressure. A thermometer reading that the temperature is rising. Putin's response to all of this has been exactly what you would expect from a man who has no tools left except control. Crackdowns on communication, tighter restrictions on information flow, the digital iron curtain Tatiana described. Not economic reform, not a recalibration of war aims, not an acknowledgement that the machine is producing human misery at industrial scale, just more silence, more suppression, more of the same. That is the strategy of a leader who has run out of options and knows it, even if he will never say so. $2.5 trillion spent on a war that has lasted longer than the Second World War. GDP growth collapsed. a record-breaking mountain of unpaid commercial debt, food prices rising faster than wages, soldiers killing each other for sustenance. An entire generation of young Russians looking at their country and seeing nothing worth building toward. State polling showing a leader bleeding support in a system designed to make that impossible. Putin wanted to restore the Soviet Empire. He got the Soviet collapse instead. He wanted to project strength across Europe. He projected desperation. He wanted to leave a legacy of conquest. He is leaving a legacy of ruin. Consider the accounting. $2.5 trillion spent. What did that buy? A strip of Ukrainian land roughly one-tenth the size of Texas. A body count in the hundreds of thousands. A domestic economy producing its lowest growth in a decade. Food prices unrecognizable to anyone who bought groceries in 2015. A generation of young Russians who described their country as bleak, expensive, and hopeless. State polling that shows declining trust, even when declining trust carries personal risk. The mathematics of this war have never favored Russia. What Putin calculated was that the human mathematics would, that his people would endure more, that his soldiers would absorb more, that the West's solidarity would fracture faster than Russia's will. And for a time, because propaganda is powerful, because fear is a real force, because people rationalize enormous suffering when the alternative is confronting that it was pointless, those human mathematics held. They are not holding anymore. The Russia that Putin believed he could forge, disciplined, expanding, feared, no longer exists. It may never have existed outside of his own imagination. What does exist is a country paying the price for his imagination in blood and rubles, with no end in sight and no mechanism to stop the man who started it all. Putin wanted the Soviet Union. He created the Soviet twilight. He wanted an empire. He built a trap. And for the first time in over 2 decades, the people living inside that trap are starting to say so out loud. Something has broken inside Russia, and the break is deepening. If you found value in this, subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next.